Hello, Bio 104 students. In this lecture, we'll have the second of two lectures on the biodiversity and evolution of animals. Okay, where we left last time was on the deuterostomes here in the bilatery and phylogeny. So we covered in detail the relationships and aspects of biology of the protostomes, focusing on aspects of evolution of the arthropods and insects. And what we're going to do today is focus on the diversity and evolution of the deuterostomes. Okay, so here is a detailed phylogeny of the major groups of deuterostomes. The common ancestor of deuterostomes was bilaterally symmetrical. Remember, all bilaterian animals have that bilateral symmetry. And however, as we look at the diversity of deuterostomes, we see some deuterostomes, such as the echinoderms, are not bilaterally symmetrical. They're radially symmetrical. And this radial symmetry is secondarily evolved in the echinoderms. Now, if we look at the other major clade of the deuterostomes, these are the chordates. And indeed, this is the clade that the vertebrates are resolved. So all chordates have a notochord, a dorsal hollow nerve cord, and a postanal tail. And as we get to more in our part of the tree of life, where we as humans reside, vertebrates have a vertebral column, an anterior skull, a large brain, and a ventral heart. Now, deuterostomes and maybe even chordates have a very deep time fossil record going back to the Cambrian here. So here is a presumptive deuterostome that dates to about 535 million years ago. The fossil dates to about 535 million years ago. Okay, now we're going to zero in on the phylogeny of the vertebrates here. So we are moving from the deuterostome phylogeny, and we're going to zero in on the vertebrate branch here. So let's expand that. Now, the thing that becomes readily apparent in looking at the phylogeny of vertebrates is that essentially all vertebrates, except those that we call tetrapods, that is the vertebrates that have 4 limbs, are fishes. So fish, unlike mammal, is a paraphyletic group because basically fishes includes all vertebrates except those that are tetrapods. Therefore, there are some things that we think of as fishes, such as coelacanths and lungfishes, that are more closely related to us as tetrapods than they are to other fishes. Now, for the rest of the lecture, we're going to be focusing on the diversity and evolutionary history of vertebrates, and we're going to focus on 3 aspects. First, we're going to look at the evolution of jaws in vertebrates. We're going to then look at the evolution of terrestriality that's associated with limbs and digits. And note that vertebrates start colonizing terrestrial habitats about 370 million years ago, which is similar timing to the colonization of land by plants. And then as we get into more of the tetrapod phylogeny, we're going to focus on the evolution of the amniotic egg, which indeed defines a group of tetrapod vertebrates known as amniotes. Okay, now ancestrally, vertebrates were jawless. So they were likely mostly filter feeding, but there were some other predaceous lineages of jawless vertebrates. And basically, the general architecture of the anatomy is you have a skull with cartilage, and the gills arches that support the gills are made of cartilage. Then what ends up happening is that gill arches become modified to become the upper and lower jaws. So in a sense, the gill arches in the early vertebrates are homologous to the upper and lower jaws of all jawed vertebrates. And then there's the modification of other gill arches that provide support for the jaws, which eventually will then support teeth. Now, there are two lineages of jawless vertebrates. They're the hagfishes and the lampreys that are still living with us today. But if this phylogeny were to include the fossil lineages, there are many other extinct lineages of jawless vertebrates. So we're going to start looking at the jawed vertebrates. So let's start looking at some of the fish groups. So the chondrichthyes, the sharks, skates, and rays, there's about 1,200 species of those. Then most of what we think of as fishes are the ray fin fishes or the actinopterygians, really diverse in marine and freshwater habitats, very morphologically and ecologically diverse as well. And there's about 33,000 species of ray fin fishes. Now, as we look at the phylogeny of living vertebrates, here is again what I said when we were looking at the big vertebrate phylogeny earlier. So here are the sharks, skates, and rays. So here are the common ancestor, all the jawed vertebrates, a group called the gnathostomes. So missing from this phylogeny are the hagfish and the lampreys. So the sharks, skates, and rays are the sister lineage to all other jawed vertebrates. Then you have the ray fin fishes. This is the actinopterygii here. So most of what we think of as a fish, most of the fishes depicted in Nemo, except for the school bus and some of the sharks, are ray fin fishes. And then the ray fin fishes are the sister lineage to a large group of vertebrate species that include the tetrapods, but have these two other quote unquote fish lineages, the coelacanths and the lungfishes. Now, basically, it's in this lineage where we see the evolution of terrestrial vertebrates, such as the amphibians, exemplified here by the salamander. So the question had long existed, how do we go from a fish-like thing, such as a lungfish, to a terrestrial vertebrate-like thing, such as this salamander or other amphibians? And what became really curious is, how did we transition from fishes that have fin-like structures? So here's the coelacanth, and here's Euthyphopteron. This is a Devonian fossil lineage that is more closely related to tetrapods than either is to the coelacanth. Okay, so this would be another fish that's more closely related to the tetrapods than it is to other fishes. So we go from a very fish fin-like thing in Euthyphopteron, then later on we end up just in the fossil record appearing tetrapods that have limbs. So what is going on with this transition between a fin, a fish-like fin, and a tetrapod-like limb? Okay. And this question gained a lot of insight, or answers to this question started emerging from the discovery in 2004 of a very important fossil called Tiktaalik. Professor Neil Shubin at the University of Chicago, the author of the book and Your Inner Fish, which was made into a 3-part PBS series, really wonderful series, and I encourage you all to go to read the book and or see the PBS series. So Tiktaalik filled in a really important gap between the fish-like fin of Euthyphopteron and the limb-like, or the limb-like limb, the tetrapod-like limb that we see in Acanthostega. And the key for Tiktaalik was not that it had evolved digits at the end of the limb, but that Tiktaalik actually had a wrist. So Tiktaalik presumably was able to have some radial motion on these forelimbs. And the authors of the paper that described Tiktaalik, led by Professor Shubin, hypothesized that the wrist radial movement of the wrist allowed Tiktaalik to actually, in a sense, do push-ups, to be able to push itself up off of the bottom of their aquatic habitats. Okay, So moving on into the living lineages of tetrapods, we have the lungfishes. These are not tetrapods. So the tetrapods are the amphibians, the common ancestor of amphibians and all amniotes. So there is about 7,000 living species of amphibians, and most of you are probably familiar with salamanders. So here is a salamander that we find in cave habitats. And surely everybody is familiar with frogs and toads. But there's a group of amphibians you may not be familiar with. They're called caecilians. They're subfossorial, that they live mostly underground, and they've lost their limbs, so they're limbless, and most of them are blind as well. So no, this is not a worm. This is not an eel or a snake. It is a legless amphibian. So three major living lineages of amphibians: frogs and toads, salamanders, and then caecilians. Now, it's clear that the ancestral state for tetrapods was a reliance on aquatic habitats, freshwater habitats, to complete reproduction. Now, some fully terrestrial salamanders and frogs have, in a sense, they don't need to return to standing bodies of water, but they need some type of water resource or very moist, humid environments to facilitate reproduction. Now, a big innovation in the evolution of tetrapods was the origin of the amniotic egg, which allows reproduction in terrestrial habitats without relying on water. So basically, the common ancestor to all the amniotes had the amniotic egg. And here is a nice advertisement, a joke advertisement about evolution proudly presenting the amniotic egg. Has an amniotic sac protecting the goo. It has the chorion. It allows gas exchange. It has the yolk, delicious food. It has a shell, shielding you from the terrible outdoors. So if we look now at the major living lineages of amniotes, we find that the amniotes basically contain all of the reptiles, which include the birds. Remember, that was our example of a paraphyletic group, or reptiles. If we have crocodilians, turtles, and snakes and lizards, and tuatara, which is a really interesting species poor ancient lineage containing only one species. It's a sister lineage to all the snakes and lizards. That by excluding birds, reptiles are a paraphyletic group. So if we just go ahead and include birds, we have a monophyletic reptiles. So birds are here in the theropods. And as you'll note here, there are some dinosaurs that are more closely related to birds than they are to other dinosaurs. Therefore, birds are living dinosaurs. And this whole gamish here of the reptiles is the sister lineage to our part of the amniote tree of life, the mammals. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the reptiles. Now, what I want you to be thinking about with species diversity is that, well, obviously, this is not something that you're going to need to memorize, given the way we're evaluating or grading in the course. But what I think is important is to be thinking about the relative biodiversity of these major groups of organisms, and to ask questions as to why species diversity may be disparate among particularly closely related lineages. So here we're looking at the reptile phylogeny. So we've collapsed down these are the living lineages. So here we have the birds. They are the sister lineage to the crocodilians. And we have the turtles. And then we have the lepidosaurs, which include snakes and lizards, and the tuatara. So if we look at the lepidosaurs, we have about 7,500 species. Then if we look at turtles, there's only about 300 species. So there are an order of magnitude fewer turtles than there are lepidosaurs. In the same token, if we look at the number of species of crocodilians, there's only 24 species. So crocodilians have 2 orders of magnitude less species diversity than lepidosaurs. However, crocodilians and birds are sister lineages, that is relative to the lineages that are alive today. And birds, this is actually, we'll see this on a slide in a subsequent slide, there's about 12,500 species of living birds. So there is a great disparity in species diversity between birds and crocodilians. And this begs the question, in terms of the evolutionary history of these lineages, why is one lineage much more species rich than the other? Okay, so here is that corrected species diversity I promised. Birds are about 12,500 species. Birds have powered flight. They're bipedal, meaning that they walk or rest on 2 legs. That is because the other limbs obviously are modified into wings. They're endothermic, meaning that they're warm-blooded, and they have this unique trait of feathers. Now, the story of birds starts with dinosaurs in the Mesozoic. All right, so we're going way, way back into a long time ago, into the Mesozoic, where dinosaurs were the dominant terrestrial vertebrates through a long stretch of the history of vertebrate diversity. And during the Mesozoic, there were a lot of dinosaurs, and they were essentially classified into 2 major clades: the bird-hipped dinosaurs, the Ornithischia, which ironically are not closely related to birds, and the Saurischia, the lizard-hipped birds. So here is a phylogenetic tree that includes most, if not all, of the major lineages of dinosaurs. And you can see birds here are nested well within the phylogeny, meaning that there are many dinosaur lineages that are more closely related to birds than they were to other dinosaurs. Now, the theropod dinosaurs basically have the common ancestor, or the shared derived characters that all theropod dinosaurs, including birds, possess, is a furcula, that is the wishbone, air sacs. Most of them have a 3-fingered hand, and the presence of feathers. So here we're looking at a theropod dinosaur phylogeny, and what we see is that feathers evolve in a set of steps, but feathers evolve prior to the origin of birds. So feathers, in a sense, are relative to all of the theropod dinosaurs, are a shared ancestral trait. However, given living lineages, feathers are a shared derived trait that help define birds. However, it's clear that feathers evolved prior to the evolution of powered flight. Now, what we see, if we go back in the phylogeny here, we have this lineage Archaeopteryx that is the sister lineage, at least in this phylogeny, of living birds. So let's take a look at Archaeopteryx. I think I showed you Archaeopteryx in one of the 3 lectures that we had on campus here in New Haven. So Archaeopteryx is this really wonderful fossil. There's an apocryphal story that the founder of the Peabody Museum here at Yale, O.C. Marsh, had an opportunity to buy the fossil, but haggled over the difference of a couple, maybe $300 or so. Maybe it was more than that, but this is in 19th century dollars, and walked away from what is probably, I would argue, the most famous fossil known. So Archaeopteryx has a really interesting combination of traits that we see only in living birds, such as having feathers and a 3-fingered hand. But it has a lot of traits that we don't see in birds, such as having fingered claws and teeth, as well as a bony tail. Okay, So Archaeopteryx really is this really nice transition from what we see in theropod dinosaurs leading to birds, and that what we see in living birds. Now, there have been a number of great discoveries of feathered dinosaurs. And this critter here, Ornithosaurus, and clearly had feathers, but it's not clear if these were flying, gliding, or for display, for show, for inter or intra species communication. Now, if we look at feathers, we're going to talk a little bit about feathers when we talk about the evolution of development. That we see the evolution of, indeed, at times in bird evolution, there were birds that had four wings, that their hind limbs were feathered and wing-like as well, as evidenced with this fossil taxon Microraptor, this theropod dinosaur. Then what we see as we get to, in the phylogeny of the theropod dinosaurs, as we get to birds, is the evolution of powered flight and the loss of these hind wings. Now, with regard to flight, flight has evolved 3 times. Powered flight, wings have evolved 3 times in vertebrates. We see it in the pterosaurs, which are an extinct group, and we're going to have we'll talk in a minute about pterosaurs. We see it in birds, and we see it in bats, in mammals. So it's thought that the initial function of feathers in theropod dinosaurs was probably for thermal regulation, perhaps repelling water, or some type of within or between species displays. Then feathers were later co-opted for gliding and flight and other functions that we see in living birds, using their feathers for functions such as sound production. Okay, pterosaurs, showing here, these were really large flying animals. So here is a typical adult human male in comparison to these 2 different species within this genus of pterosaurs. Now, it's important to point out that pterosaurs are not dinosaurs. When I was a kid, pterosaurs were included in my child's book of dinosaurs. But if we look at the phylogeny here, we see that pterosaurs are resolving well outside of the clade that we characterize as dinosaurs. That, of course, includes living birds. Okay, so at about 66 million years ago, we talked about the transition, one of the mass extinction events in our short lecture on the fossil record, involving the extinction of dinosaurs and the origin and radiation of placental mammals and of living birds. This extinction event is thought to have occurred from the crashing of a large meteor into Earth here near the present-day Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. And if you look at the bottom of the Gulf here, basically you can see there is an impression, a crater, an underwater crater from where this meteor hit 66 million years ago. And this caused a cataclysmic extinction event, not only from the initial impact and explosion, but from the dust and debris that was kicked up in the atmosphere, essentially created something akin to what people have proposed will happen in an event of a large-scale nuclear war, a nuclear winter, where there's so much debris in the atmosphere that it prevents sunlight from reaching the surface. And this would have had a dramatic effect on primary productivity, things like cyanobacteria, plants, and other photosynthetic organisms. And without that primary productivity, there's no food, and it was thought that there was a massive die-off. And indeed, this is where in the fossil record, remember we had these 3 huge mass extinction events. This is the most recent of the mass extinction events, where just looking at the fossil record, there's dramatic turnover of lineages, meaning that as we go from one bin of time to the next, there's a big increase in the number of lineages that disappear from the fossil record. So there were a lot of changes in the plant and animal diversity in terrestrial habitats. Indeed, there was a lot of change in marine habitats as well. But one of the things that we really see following the end of the Cretaceous, this mass extinction event, is not only the loss of most of the dinosaurs, say most because we still have living birds, and then we start seeing changes that include the radiation of the living lineages of placental mammals. Now, remember, mammals are the sister group to reptiles. So if we go to the amniote common ancestor, we have one branch leading to all the diversity of reptiles, and then this other lineage that leads to the diversity of the living lineages of mammals. So this begs the question is, where did mammals come from? And we covered this a couple of times, one in that short fossil record lecture. So what I'm showing you here is a phylogeny of tetrapods, and specific then leading to the amniotes, and all of the lineages that are in bold are living lineages. All the lineages that are not in bold are lineages that are extinct. And what we see here is the common ancestor of the amniotes. Here we have the reptiles, and remember the mammals, the living mammal lineages up here are the sister lineage to the reptiles. And what we see is this whole sequence of phylogenetically nested lineages, branching lineages. These are called the mammal-like reptiles, or the non-mammalian synapsids. So synapsids is a clade name that is based on the ancestral state in terms of the number of fenestra, or the number of openings in the skull. All right, now there's this really remarkable lineage, or sets of lineages. It's a paraphyletic group, the non-mammalian synapsids. And indeed, if we were to show the geologic age that these fossil taxa are found, you would see that the older lineages are phylogenetically deeper branching. The younger lineages, in terms of the age of the fossils, are more derived in the phylogeny, and in a sense, more closely related to the living mammals. Now, what is really interesting in terms of what these mammal-like reptiles provide is they show a really great transition of how bones in the lower jaw of reptiles and the non-mammalian synapsids become modified to become the inner ear bones that indeed define mammals, or one of the traits that define mammals. So here, then we have the clade that includes the common ancestor of all the major living lineages of mammals, and they have mammary glands. Their shared derived characters are having mammary glands, lactation, hair or fur, and 3 bones in the inner ear. Now, looking at the diversity of living mammals, we have the protherians, or the monotremes, of which there are 5 species. This is your echidna and duck-billed platypus. These lay shelled eggs, but still have fur and lactation. Then there's a group called the therians. It's a common ancestor that is shared with the marsupials. So the marsupials are found primarily in Australia and South America, although we have a marsupial that lives in the Saybrook courtyard, and probably one that lives in all of the college courtyards. That is the opossum, is a lineage that likely has a South American origin that basically dispersed into North America with the formation of the Panamanian Isthmus millions of years ago. So there are about 350 species of marsupials, more species than we find of monotremes. So these are, again, the monotremes, your egg-laying mammals, 5 species. The echidna and duck-billed platypus are 2 of the 5 species. And then the marsupials, 350 species. typically characterized by kangaroos and the opossum. Okay, then in our part of the mammalian tree, we are eutherian mammals. That is placental mammals. And there's about 5,300 species. So most species, most of mammalian diversity are placental mammals. And by definition, placental mammals have a placenta, which is a flattened organ in the uterus of pregnant eutherian mammals that provides nourishment and maintaining the fetus through an umbilical cord that allows it not only to feed it for gas exchange, but to eliminate its waste products. Now, we are amniotes. We may not have an amniotic egg that is being placental mammals, but it's clear there's a number of traits that are shared homologies between the amniotic egg and the placenta of placental mammals. Now, mammal phylogeny has actually been a very dynamic and interesting field over the past decade and a half or so. Certainly in my own scientific lifetime, our views of mammal phylogeny have changed dramatically. And these dramatic changes have been brought about primarily through the utilization of DNA sequence data to infer phylogeny. So, for example, previously, the previous view of phylogeny, what I'm showing you are the different colors to show how the phylogeny has changed. So essentially, all of the lineages in red were thought to be dramatically dispersed across the phylogeny. They were dispersed in a group called the insectivores. These are your moles, for example. They were the hyrax and the manatees. Very, very disparate lineages of mammals. However, with the onset of molecular phylogenetics, all of these disparate lineages were consistently resolved as a monophyletic group in these phylogenetic analyses. And this group was then named the Afrotheria because if you look at what was likely the ancestral geographic area for this clade, it was Africa. Now, Afrotheria put together very disparate lineages such as the elephant and the elephant shrew. The elephant shrew was always categorized as an insectivore and thought to be distantly related to elephants. However, once this phylogeny, the new molecular phylogeny emerged, a number of shared morphological characters that were then reinterpreted as homologies between the elephant and the elephant shrew. Now, the radiation of placental mammals likely started in the Cretaceous. So what I'm showing you here is, let's reduce my talking head here a bit. So here is a molecular phylogeny of mammals that's time calibrated, okay? So the divergence, say, of these two clades dates to, draw the line down here, to about 60 million years or so, or a little bit after 66 million years. Because what I'm showing you here with this red line, this line is at 66 million years. So the diversification that happened in the Cretaceous would all be on the left side of that red line. All of the diversification events that happened in the Cenozoic following the Cretaceous would be on the right side of that line. So while the major groups of placental mammals, so here are the placental mammals, here are the marsupials, and there are the monotremes, so the duck-billed platypus and echidna. And we could see that marsupials and placentals share a common ancestor here about 180 million years ago. All of the placental mammals share a common ancestor about 100 million years ago. But while it seems that the major groups of placental mammals began diversifying in the Cretaceous, much of the diversification events that involve the diversity of the families and or genera that we think of, that comprise modern living placental mammal diversity, clearly happened after the Cretaceous into the Cenozoic. And mammals have done an amazing, have diversified ecologically to exploit an amazing array of habitats. Obviously, placental mammals are terrestrial. We have placental mammals that live in trees. We have placental mammals that live subterranean. They basically live underground. They burrow. And we have bats that have taken to the air. We have whales and relatives that have taken to the water. And we look at our own clade primates. We diversified into the trees, then out of the trees. And with regard to primates, indeed, we are closely related in the placental tree of life to rodents. So rodents and primates are not that distantly related. Now, the primate lineage goes all the way back to the late Cretaceous, but the African apes, which includes our part of the primate tree of life, where humans reside, was more recent, likely in the Miocene, about 20 to 23 million years ago. So we have the lemurs and lorises, which are the living sister lineage to all other primates. We have the tarsiers, which are these very cute tree-dwelling primates. And then we have what we typically think of as primates, that is, all the primates that are not tarsiers, lorises, or lemurs. So we have the old world monkeys, such as the gibbons and the macaques. The macaques, and we have the gibbons that are the sister lineage to the great apes. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention here, all of the New World or the Western Hemisphere primates are the sister lineage to all of the other simians. And then basically the great apes would include the orangutans and the African apes and the humans. Now, the lineage so let's just go back here. Of course, the African apes and humans includes the gorilla, the bonobo and chimpanzee. There may be two species of chimpanzee, the bonobo and the chimpanzee, and then our species, Homo sapien. Now, the lineage that includes humans goes back to about 6 million years. However, most of our closest relatives have radiated in a period of about the past 4 million years. And the clade that includes all of the lineages that are classified as Homo have diversified over the past 2 million years. And so the sister lineage to Homo sapiens is Homo neanderthalensis, as well as these other extinct Homo lineages, Homo erectus and Homo floresiensis. Now, what genomic studies have shown is that subsequent to the divergence of these species of Homo, that basically the genomes of living humans contain evidence of hybridization with these other Homo species. So for example, folks who have ancestry from Western and Northern Europe have a portion of their genome, likely contain a portion of their genome that's shared with Homo neanderthalensis, with Neanderthals. And it's thought that subsequent to their speciation, there was some limited hybridization and introgression, in a sense, lateral gene transfer from Neanderthals into modern day humans. Now, Neanderthals went extinct about 28,000 years ago. The Floresiensis went extinct about 50,000 years ago, and Homo erectus went extinct about 250,000 years ago. And prior to the extinction of Neanderthal, we have the evidence of expansion of our species out of Africa and expansion of our species into the Western Hemisphere about 12,000 to 20,000 years ago. Okay, so some of the things we should be thinking about in this second lecture on animal diversity is understanding the phylogenetic relationships among the major animal lineages, that is the deuterostomes, with the origin of vertebrates and jaws and their movement to land. With bird evolution, think about feathers and flight. And with mammal evolution, think about timing and diversification. But also bear in mind the disparity in species diversity among the major living lineages of vertebrates. And this will become important when we begin investigating and discussing evolutionary radiations in a subsequent lecture. So Bio 104 students, until next time, be well, be safe.